the really major preoccupations of Pauline studies, at least for the past 200 years, has been trying to separate what we might call the Paul of history from the Paul of the Bible, or the Paul of faith. What this means is that scholars have wanted to know, what was the real historical Paul like? And was he the same as, or was he different from the Paul that we remember in Christian tradition and memory? And this process has meant that Paul's archive, the collection of letters that make up his portion of the New Testament, along with the book of Acts, which purports to tell a kind of narrativized story of Paul's life, have been subject to a lot of historical analysis. And that historical analysis has largely been a process of sifting and sorting. Sifting out the things, the letters that we think were written by the historical Paul versus the letters that we think were written by people that came after Paul. And for the most part, the consensus position that has developed from that is that there are, of the 13 books in the New Testament that bear the name of Paul, 7 of them were written by Paul and 6 were not. And the ones that were not are typically thought of as 1st and 2nd Timothy. Those are the pastoral epistles. And more or less, almost everybody thinks that those are not written by Paul, that they are written by somebody writing in Paul's name at least several generations after Paul had left the scene. Next are Ephesians and Colossians. Those are also letters that are a little bit more debatable in the scholarly literature, but that most people think were not written by Paul. Part of why we think this is because Ephesians and Colossians have a different kind of theology, they have a different writing style, and in some ways they're actually copying one another. So there's something going on with those two letters. And then the last letter that people think might not be written by Paul is 2nd Thessalonians. And here the scholarship is quite mixed, where some people think it is, maybe it's 50-50 that people think that Paul wrote that or not. So sifting and sorting what Paul wrote and what he didn't has been part of trying to figure out who the historical Paul was. At the same time, the same optics have been applied to the book of Acts, which is a story written sometime in the 2nd century of the history of Christianity, of followers of Jesus after the death and resurrection of Jesus, up until Paul's imprisonment in Rome. And the story in Acts has long been thought of as just the story about what happened to Paul, what happened to Peter after the death and resurrection of Jesus. And Acts itself has come under a great deal of scrutiny. I'm generally persuaded of the fact that Acts is a largely legendary account, not written by someone who was a friend of Paul or had access to the life of Paul or even really had access to much of direct information about Paul's life, but someone who is telling a largely legendary story about Paul as the heroic founder of early Christian communities. And in that sense, the Acts of Paul does not really, or the Acts does not offer us a lot of information about a historical Paul. So what does that leave us with? It leaves us with 7 letters that comprise what biblical scholars tend to think of as the things that Paul actually wrote. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philippians, Galatians, and Philemon. I think I've said them all. Now, the problem also with constructing a historical Paul from these letters is that these are not letters that tell us much about Paul's biography. They are not letters wherein he describes his childhood. They don't tell about his early life. The things that we tend to want for writing, say, a biography. When you write a biography of, say, Martin Luther King or Bill Clinton or whoever, some famous figure, you want to know about where they grew up. You want to be able to interview people that knew them. You want to be able to read a lot of material that they wrote when they were young. You want to read a lot of things. And when you stack up the stuff that we think might have come from the historical Paul, it's pretty thin. And it's mostly directed to issues that are contemporary to the moment for that particular letter. We can add onto this the problem of the fact that we don't really have the actual letters of Paul. We don't have access to his letters. We have access to copies upon copies upon copies of those letters that were preserved by ancient Christians. And it seems, and it is quite likely, that those ancient Christians edited those letters as they preserved them, that changes were introduced, that new material was added, that some things were combined together in novel ways, maybe even some theological phrases that wouldn't have passed muster in a later generation were smoothed over. So we don't really know, even when we're reading the quote-unquote historical letters of Paul, we don't really know if we're actually reading what Paul wrote, and in fact we probably aren't. So it means that the project of creating a historical Paul is really hard and probably impossible. Um, but biblical scholars have spent a lot of time doing this. They've parsed very minute phrases. They have spent a lot of time trying to suss out details, to put some context around these letters, because they really want to be able to tell a story about the life of this guy named Paul. And what I suspect is that probably what's going on here is that really at the end of the day, what Paul is someone that, in the words of Wayne Meeks, is basically a Proteus, is someone who becomes whatever a biblical scholar or a reader needs him to be. That just like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, that he can become all things to all people, that he is all things to all biblical scholars. And that every generation you find people writing about Paul, and lo and behold, Paul ends up being a lot like them. Paul ends up being on the side of whatever political, or theological, or social debates that they are on. Paul, the historical Paul at the end of the day, is a cipher for what do we care about, and what matters to us, and how might we go about anchoring our interests and our ethics in a ostensibly mythical biblical figure.